فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary podcast. So for today, I want to do a recap. And one of the things I like doing in my classes and my courses is after we finish a section, we ask the students and we ask everyone who's attended, what did we learn? What was the recap? How can we take the lessons from the previous section into the new one? And today I want to recap the verses of Maryam, or the Islamic Mary, in Surat Imran, or the chapter of the Family of Imran. And I want to preface this section and this podcast today with a quote. And one of the things I've been trying to do in my research as a historian and as someone interested in biblical and Quranic figures is to find a voice, give voice to some figures, show some history and agency to mufassirin or Quranic exegetes, show that many of these stories have had a life historically and continue to have one into the modern world. And in my research, I've encountered different scholars who've written on biblical figures. One of them is Mona Siddiqui, who writes a lot on Christian-Muslim relations. And she actually has a chapter in her book regarding Maryam and her potential. And she makes this observation that I've given a lot of thought about. So she says, with Mary, or the Christian Mary, we see an image of liberation of women from poverty and justice. However, within Islam, Mary has no such role, for the story of Jesus pales her own significance. And I really thought a lot about that, because she's saying here that in Christianity, Mary has an independent role and a liberatory role, that she's a woman, she's fighting against poverty, she is fighting against injustice. But in Islam, what is the role of Mary? How does she inspire people, whether historically or in contemporary times? And she's saying in Jesus, however, is really the protagonist. Jesus is the one we talk about. And of course, Jesus is important, whether that's in Christianity or Islam. In Islam, Jesus is a prophet, and he has his own story and verses related to him. Now, in some ways, when I read this quote, I agree that when I look at Mary, or Maryam, in the Islamic tradition, a lot of times there is this focus on Jesus and less so on Maryam. However, other parts of me disagree. And they say, well, Maryam is someone, if you look closely at the Quranic verses, the prophetic tradition, she is someone who is a protagonist. She's someone you can see in her own right. And through my research, even in contemporary times, many Muslims, Muslim women, and Muslim men look at Maryam as an independent figure and find inspiration in her story. And I highlight that, whether that be in literature and documentary or in theology, Maryam continues to inspire. So part of my work is not only to look at Maryam historically and see what the Quranic verses and hadith say about her, but also see her reception. How do people now find ways to connect with her and see her as a way to perpetuate modern spirituality? So let's go ahead and look at some of the verses. So we actually have gone through many verses regarding Maryam, and the style or the methodology has been to look at one verse and see what lessons we can learn from that verse. But today I want to look at a bunch of them and all the different verses that we've looked at in Imran in preparation to go to Surat Maryam, or the chapter of Mary. So we see in the beginning of Imran that her mother is devoting herself, right? She's devoting what's in her stomach, her literary batni. And she's saying, I want you, God, to accept what's in my stomach for you because you are the one that's all hearing and all knowing. And then, however, and this is kind of the plot twist, is that when she gives birth, it's a boy, right? So she had these implicit dreams, right? If you look at the verses, she never says, I'm going to have a son or I want to have a son. But I think for a lot of parents, whether that be in the medieval or the modern world, when they say, I want a child, maybe that's implied, right? That they're saying, hey, I really want to have a son because a son can do all these things. The son doesn't have any restrictions placed upon them where women might have that. So in a similar way, she doesn't explicitly say, hey, God, give me a son, but she wants a child that is going to serve in the temple and be a religious leader and play a prominent role within society. However, she gives birth to a girl. And then the divine voice in the Qur'an, Wallahu a'lam. So it says God knows best what you have delivered, and the male is not like the female. Then the mother, she realizes that this is a gift from God, that she should accept this daughter, and this daughter is going to do great things, right? Maybe even greater things than if it was just a son. And she names that daughter Maryam, and she seeks refuge from the Satan, from Shaitan, and make sure that she lives in a purified state. Then we see that she grows up. So from the beginning, we have her origin, we have her birth, we hear from her mother, we hear this prayer, and then she grows up, she becomes a wonderful person. And it says, وَأَنْبَتَهَا نَبَاتًا حَسَنًا, right? It has a pleasant upbringing, and she's entrusted to the care of Zechariah, who is a relative. Now, we see here that Maryam doesn't just jump all the way to the birth of Jesus, but now she's an independent figure, she's a young woman, and this older man, this religious figure, that this person who you thought Maryam was going to be, right? When you think of Maryam's mother, she wanted her daughter to be like Zechariah. She wanted her daughter to be a religious figure and to be a leader within the sacred space. However, this person who is seen as a model of spirituality, who is a prophet in himself, every time he enters into the sanctuary, he sees that she has this rizqah, this provision, these fruits out of season. And he asks her, and this is part of the story of Maryam that continues, he always asks, right, this one word in Arabic, anna, how is this possible? This is something that Zechariah uses to ask Maryam, but it's also the same word he uses to ask God when he is given the sign of a child. And it's the same word that Maryam uses, right? How can I have a child when no man has touched me? And Maryam, very confidently, she responds to Zechariah and says, قَالَتْ هُوَ مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ, that this is from God, these provisions, these fruits, and that he has the ability to provide without any limits. And this is a spiritual lesson. As we discussed, Maryam is a teacher. So we've gone now from the birth of Maryam to now she's grown up in a righteous manner. She is now teaching other people, especially people who are older than her and seemingly more wise and pious. And then the angels, they speak to Maryam and they say that you've been chosen, istafaki, and you've been purified, wataharaki, and then you've been wastafaki, you've been chosen again of all the world's women. So here we see this interesting narrative, right? This beautiful origin story where she goes from her mother being surprised and not even sure if she wanted her to now eventually accepting her, to her growing up, her teaching, and now this annunciation that she's told that you've been chosen and that you've been purified and that you're unique, you're special, you're someone that God loves and accepts. And then we see here that after she is given this chosenness and after she is asked to be among the righteous, that the angels, they say to her, now prostrate yourself and be devout and warka'i ma'raki'in, and bow down to those who bow down. So now she is seen not only as someone who is special and devout, but she is unique within her community. She is told that she should be part of a community. She shouldn't separate herself and isolate herself, but she should go and be among those who prostrate. And then we have this fascinating verse. And part of my research in Quranic and biblical figures is that in the narrative of the story, that sometimes there's breaks and pauses. And the divine voice of the Qur'an, it speaks to the reader in general, saying the different lessons that they learn, but also sometimes speaks directly to the Prophet Muhammad and tells the Prophet Muhammad something distinct. So one of the challenges people have with the Quranic and biblical stories is that when you read the Qur'an, the biblical stories are scattered. It's not a simple narrative as maybe you would find in Genesis. But when you read the Qur'an, you have certain parts of the story, and then there's a verse or two that speak directly to the reader and highlights their attention. And here we see in verse 44 that the Quran now says that this is the news of the unseen we reveal to you, O Prophet. So the Quran is saying here that you didn't know this before to the Prophet Muhammad, that these stories of Maryam, of Zechariah, of Christianity, they are important, they're sacred, they have lessons that you and the Muslim community can learn from, but they were in the ghaib, in the unseen, that you had to have revelation to really access them, understand them, and implement them within your life. And then it says you are not with them when they cast lots to decide who would be Mary's guardian. So it's referencing a biblical story, that there is a discussion of who would take care of Maryam. And eventually Zechariah would be that person. So the Quran is saying that you weren't present, you weren't there when many of these historical elements of the story were being carried out. You still weren't born. You were in Arabia. But God was there and was watching. And then nor were you there when they argued about it. So there was a whole debate and discussion about who would be the kafil, the guardian for Maryam. And eventually Zechariah would win that argument. And we weren't necessarily present during the time of Joseph, of Yusuf, of Moses, Musa, of Maryam. But however, these stories are still relevant and important for our spiritual development. So to conclude, yes, I agree with Mona Siddiqui that the full potential of Maryam hasn't been explored in Islam. And when I go and I interact with Christian audiences or those people who hold Mary in esteem, for many Christians, the potential of Mary hasn't been explored. And there is a lot of emphasis on Jesus as a figure and protagonist and savior. However, we see that within Christianity, Mary has different understandings. In some corners of Christianity, there's people who reject Mary because they see her as someone who is just espousing the church teachings on women. However, there are others who embrace Mary and see her as the model woman, a model of devotion and piety. And they see her as someone who would advocate justice and have a liberatory potential. And that point for me especially has been captivating, that Maryam is not only someone who is important in terms of spirituality, in terms of worship, of prostration, of prayer, but also someone that can inspire people in social justice, and that they can inspire people to fight systemic racism or colonialization or injustice, and that Maryam has this potential to provide activism with a spiritual grounding. But I also disagree, right? I also see that when I read the Quranic verses, I see a story, right? I see a story of Maryam appear that's independent and unique. No one would say that Abraham or Ibrahim, for instance, isn't a figure in his own right in the Qur'an or the prophetic tradition. No one would say that Abraham pales in significance to his son Isaac or Ishmael or Ismail. Rather, we would see everyone, right? If in Christianity, Judaism, Islam would say Ibrahim, he's his own figure. But when it comes to Maryam, then we might say, oh, she may not be as important and she doesn't have a story of her own. However, in these verses that we covered today in Ali Imran, we see an origin story of her own. She is someone that her mother wasn't sure she wanted and eventually got. She finally accepts her. She grows up in a beautiful way. And she has miracles of her own, like other prophetic and righteous figures in the Qur'an. She begins to teach other people, especially people who are older than her. And then the Qur'an speaks out and speaks directly to the Prophet Muhammad and to the Muslim community and says, you were not there, right? You weren't present when these different events occurred, but I'm still relaying them to you as spiritual lessons and for you to hold her in your eyes in a place of esteem and emulation. So with that, I want to thank you for listening to the Islamic Mary podcast. I would encourage you to subscribe, to share the podcast with your networks, your friends, your students, your colleagues. Also, I was really happy to see some people review the podcast. So thanks so much. I'm really grateful. If you find this meaningful, please take a couple minutes to review the podcast, give me some feedback. You can always email me as well. And I encourage you to visit my website and my newsletter. And if you subscribe to my newsletter, you can be in touch with me and see the various updates regarding my forthcoming book on the Islamic Mary. I should submit that in November, the entire draft of the book to my publisher, and then they'll work on publishing it early next year. So with that, I want to thank you once again and take care.